Now, joining me is Professor Uche Uwaleke, who is the Director of Institute of Capital Market Studies at Nassarawa State University. He is Nigeria's first professor of the capital market. Thanks for joining us on Newsnight. Good to see you again.
Thanks, it was my pleasure.
Right, so the planned 2025 budget on our minds projected 47.9 trillion naira with borrowings of 9.22 trillion naira to bridge the deficit, not in the coming budget, but in the outgoing one. That's the 2024 budget. Now, this budget, do you think it's something to be optimistic about?
Well, to be able to answer that question, you also need to look at the benchmarks and assumptions. Right. First, the government thinks it can do 2.06 million barrels per day, oil production. Mm-hmm. You look at oil production, the average we've had, particularly in 2023 and 2024, 1.3, 1.4. So you would think that's is rather ambitious, mm-hmm. Particularly when you have OPEC quota of 1.5, then condensates of about 600. And since 2022, if I recall, I don't think we've met the OPEC quota. But I want to believe that the government thinks it can, deal with the issue of oil theft and whatever that is, impinging, working against the ramping up output. Now you also look at the oil price. Oil price is at $75 per barrel. Mm. Now, if you look at international agency projections, a number of them are doing $82 per barrel for 2025. So you would say on that basis that $75 per barrel is realistic.
That's on the optimistic side. There are others who are saying it could hover somewhere around $40 per barrel.
Yes, because those projections were made by those agencies before the U.S. elections. Uh-huh. So, yes, so they didn't factor the fact that, Donald Trump, would be there because the Donald Trump's policies, his dispositions towards the, oil sector. If you recall, during Donald Trump's first period, oil prices were actually were low. Mm. So his immigration policies, his policies on America First and so on will definitely have and of course the Ukraine war, Middle East crisis, his positions will have an impact on the oil price. So again, to that extent, you could say that that may not be too realistic, particularly now that if you check even the current Brent is around $73, mm-hmm. Per barrel. Then you're also looking at the other assumptions. Take inflation rate, for example. That's the one I consider, unrealistic. 15.75% inflation projection for 2025. Exchange rate of 1,400. Again, if you look at where we are today, and then you look at the outlook for, the forex market. Again, you may also think 1,400 naira,
to the dollar.
Yes. So when you take all of that, again, GDP growth rate of 4.6 being projected. Yeah. Now, if you look at the deficit in that 2025 projection, government aggregate expenditure, FG aggregate expenditure of 47.9 trillion, mm-hmm. The expected revenue of 34.8 trillion, that gives you a deficit of over 13 trillion. The previous 2024 deficit was around 8-9 trillion. So if you look at that jump, so again, that gives you the impression that it may be inflationary, particularly when much of it, is in recurrent. The recurrent provision there is around 14 trillion for 2025. Mm. So when you have a high inflation rate in 2025, for example, it will be inconsistent with the projection of 15.75. And of course, you expect that the central bank will react by further increasing, monetary policy rate. So you will now find a situation in which 2025 will be a year in which a lot of businesses will be, brace up for, a high interest rate environment on account of some of these, assumptions and, benchmarks.
And you don't want to begin to imagine what it will do to the economy.
Yes, and if you also look at what we are budgeting for debt service for 2025, mm-hmm. Okay, we are budgeting 15 trillion for debt service. All right, again, coming from about 9 trillion for 2024 to 15 trillion. So you now find that all of that will no doubt inject a lot of liquidity, in the system in 2025. And you now tie it, you now tie it with even the new, borrowing plan that the government has.
Now, let's even talk about that borrowing plan.
Yeah.
How much sense does it really make? Because some analysts like yourself are saying, look, who approved this plan, really?
Well, Ngozi, let's be fair. The plan is in line with what you have in the budget, 2024 Appropriation Act, the new external borrowing plans. So to that extent, for me, it is in order. I don't see anything wrong in borrowing. I just came back from the National Council on Finance and Economy program in Bauchi, right, which had in attendance finance commissioners and accountant generals of states for members of the Federation Accounts Committee. The finance minister was there, and I made the point that it's not borrowing really is not bad, because if you look at our state of infrastructure today, our stock of infrastructure, to GDP at 35%. Compare that with South Africa, that's where you have 87%. The only way we can fill the infrastructure gap today is by borrowing. But I also made the point that it's not just about borrowing, but we also need to borrow right, and the social contract aspect of it, ramp up revenue. Again, I also made the point that we need to ramp up revenue, which is also why I called for, the support of the current, tax reforms that the government is implementing. Is important, is supported, particularly where it is not, resulting to an increase in tax. What is happening is simply broadening taxing, simply increasing, collection efficiency, to be able to ramp up revenue. So that's important, because if we do that, then we can reduce the burden of the debt service, because debt service revenue ratio is high because revenue, the base, is shallow. What
about the revenues generated from government, revenue agencies, like the customs? The customs Met has exceeded a target of 5 trillion naira already for 2025.
Yes.
And other, revenue generating agencies.
Yeah, so that's the point.
Can't all of this really together, including the savings from subsidy removal?
Yes. Yes.
Why do we still need to borrow?
Okay, I thought I've told you why we need to borrow.
Infrastructure deficit
how much is all of that? You see, as I said, to plug your infrastructure gap, you need to put in like $100 billion on an annual basis for the next 30 years.
I doubt very much if Nigerians are concerned really about the borrowing. It's whether these borrowings actually go to the areas where they're supposed to go to.
So that is the question.
Infrastructure and what have you.
Exactly. So that is the question. That's why I said it's not that the borrowing thing is not in order, but the questions we should be asking. Okay, for example, the 1.7 trillion that the government says they want to borrow. Okay, we need to know, for example, which projects are they going to be going to finance? Okay, how is this money going to be repaid? Okay, what are the terms and conditions? Even though we have been told terms and conditions will depend on market conditions at the time they are going to borrow. But we need to know, Nigerians need to know these things, all right?
Right,
because
and there'll also be the proposal, they proposed the Eurobond worth at least $1.7 billion, but not exceeding 2.2 billion. Help us understand.
Okay, I think what the government is, FG wants to borrow 1.7 trillion naira. As I said, part of the new external borrowing plans contained in the 2024 budget. Now, that translates to $2.2 billion.
Right.
Okay, using the exchange rate of 800 naira to the dollar. Again, that's my worry. I was wondering, why would they use exchange rate of 800 naira to dollar? Because that's not the official CBN exchange rate. Okay, so that's one aspect I will also want I will also want to be interrogated. So why use 800? Because if you use...
The official rate is double.
It's around 1,600.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you use that official rate, you are going to get an amount that is far higher than 1.7. All right? So that is one. Now, the second aspect, I mentioned it, it didn't really say, what the projects, specify the projects that will be financed by it. Again, it talks about the sources.
Yeah.
The sources, if you look at it, it says much of it will come from Eurobonds. We know Eurobonds are commercial. We know Eurobonds are non-concessional. We know Eurobonds are expensive. Again, I also have some concerns there.
What are the concerns?
Yes, I've just mentioned them. You see, when you're dealing with external borrowing, Eurobonds should be your last resort. Right. Okay, you have multilateral sources. You have bilateral sources. China, India. The Indian Prime Minister was here the other day. Okay, so we have some debts from some loans from India.
Yeah.
So we can negotiate more loans from India, as opposed to going to the international capital market to borrow, because borrowing from the international capital market is more expensive. That's my point.
Right.
Okay, I'm also thinking, why didn't, as part of these sources, why not consider to something like diaspora bond? Why not consider to, even the recent domestic dollar bond that was done, that was oversubscribed, why not do more of that? So why do we have to do euro bonds, at this time? Now, if you look at those, the sources again, they mentioned sovereign sukuk.
Yes.
Sovereign sukuk, and they said the size is just $500 billion, all right? That is the one I support, okay? $500 million. Okay? I support sovereign sukuk because any proceeds you get from issuing sukuk, they are usually tied to projects. Right. So I would advise the government to do more of sovereign sukuk in this external borrowing plan and do very little of Eurobonds, if they must even do Eurobonds at all. Because the Fiscal Responsibility Act is clear. If we must do long-term borrow, it has to be long-term, and it also has to be on concessional terms. And remember, we have currency risk, in this country today. And that is why I will advise we don't do more of external debt. If you look at the MTEF, the MTEF was even clear. The MTEF says the deficit we'll have in 2025 is, as I mentioned earlier, 13 trillion, which will be largely financed by borrowing. How is it going to be financed? The government says in that MTEF, they are going to do more of domestic debt. Oh. Why did they say that? Because they said they have a narrow window with respect to external debt, recognizing the fact that there is this currency issue and it's not always easy to go borrowing abroad. So what I'm suggesting here is, in this new arrangement, we should de-emphasize Eurobonds. We should do more of concessional debt.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Uche Uwaleke is Director, Institute of Capital Market Studies, Nassarawa State University, and the first professor of the capital market in Nigeria. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
On Newsnight.